So now let's look at the demo of AWS. So how do we ensure that in AWS? So if we look at the thumb rule that I established a little bit earlier, we're looking at the user side security as well as the device side security and the internal security. So I'll just give you a brief of how these are achieved in an Amazon system. So we're looking at Amazon because AWS is the most popular uh, cloud service provider, and they also have their own suite of IoT services, which provides different features. So when it comes to device security, the standard is secured MQTT, right? So you have the MQTT protocol, and then you can secure it with authentication and encryption. So authentication helps you to identify the credential that it's a valid device, and the encryption ensures that whatever the data that the device is sending, it is encrypted and nobody is able to see through that. And let's take a little detailed look at how the user side security is achieved, because the user side is more vulnerable, because as I said, the users can be anything. They can be genuine users, they can be users with malign, who have an intention to malign something, or they can be hackers as well. So on the user side, we need to implement certain authentication as well as authorization steps. So the typical industry standard for that is OAuth 2. So in OAuth 2, what typically happens is when you have an application running on a browser, let's say, for example, it could be a browser or it could even be a mobile app. So you are always authorized using a service called AWS Cognito. So this is one of the services in AWS, and I'll just show you a quick look at how it works. And through the AWS, you get authorized as a user, and then you also get a token. So this token is like a temporary identity for the user, which is only valid for a certain point of time, right? So here is a little more detailed kind of a ladder diagram of how this OAuth protocol really works. Now, you don't have to really get into the details of this because this is actually a protocol, but what you need to understand is that there is a two-step process over here. In one step, you validate the user credentials, and in the other step, you give the user a temporary token through which he can access the API services. Right? And this is all done using the AWS Cognito service. So whenever you have an API endpoint, and typically in a cloud-based application, you'll always have an API endpoint because users would be accessing through the API. You would always need to secure them using OAuth so that the necessary authentication and the authorization checks are in place. So let's quickly see a demo of how this is done in AWS. So I'll just go back to uh, I'll just go back to my AWS console over here. So if you can see my screen over here, so this is my AWS console, which I already have opened over here. So I'm going to make use of a couple of services. So one, I'll be using the AWS Cognito service, which provides me the necessary framework for managing my users. And the other service that I'm going to use is the API gateway, which allows me to create APIs in my AWS system. So I'll just quickly follow a few steps just to create a new API, and then we will invoke those APIs and see how can we secure those APIs further. Before we start that, we must understand that these two services work in conjunction, because even though you can define an API, you need to authorize an API. And for authorization, you will always need a user, and the users are always maintained as user pools in your system. So I already have a predefined user, which is the user as me, and I already have created certain identities for the users using the federated identities in the Amazon. So under the Amazon Cognito, these are the two things that we define: a federated identity, which provides aggregation for the different kinds of users belonging to the same organization or third party, or the intention. And I have the user pools where I have the users defined. So I already have a user, which is me. So I will try to authorize myself, and then I will try to use the authorization token to access the APIs. So let me just go ahead and create a new API. So I'll just quickly create a new API, and I'll give it a name of a web API, and I'll give it edge optimized. So once I create an API, I will have to create certain endpoints or certain resources, because API always has multiple legs and multiple elements in the URL. So for that, we can quickly create resources. So I can say IoT endpoint, and I can enable CORS over here, which is for cross-origin resource sharing. And let me just create this resource. And under the IoT endpoint, I create one more resource, which is the sensor ID. And I'm putting curly braces around it because this is where I will actually give the ID of a sensor whose data I want to fetch through the API. Right? So instead of using a hard-coded resource, I'll be using a sensor ID. So I create this resource again, and then I will, under the sensor ID, under the sensor ID, I will create a method, and let me use a post method over here. So I will be posting the sensor ID so that I can get the sensor.